Great to be here. My first time in Atlanta. I'm Katie Roof. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News based in LA, and I'm joined by Dennis Lockhart, who's very familiar with Atlanta because he used to be Atlanta's Fed president. And he's a professor at Georgia Tech. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Katie.
So I want to start with a question that's on my mind, and I'm sure on a lot of people's minds. Are we headed to a recession?
Well, I don't think we're in a recession now. The economy's growing at a slow pace, so we're still expanding at the moment. I can't rule out a recession in the future. I think a lot will depend, or at least it's boiling down to the question of how persistent is inflation and how tough does the Fed have to be to try to corral inflation. Monetary policy is not an exacting kind of thing. And even in the most recent meeting they had, the minutes show that they would prefer to overshoot rather than undershoot. So the risk of overshooting includes the risk of precipitating a recession. But I do think we have to start to distinguish between the severity of various kinds of recessions. A short, shallow recession, they're not going to say it, but I think many of the members of the Federal Open Market Committee would actually accept that. They would say that's helpful in getting inflation under control. A long duration, severe recession that conceivably brings permanent damage to the economy is a different matter altogether. So recently I've been thinking, watching Ian and other hurricanes, maybe we need a similar grading system, a Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3, Cat 4, Cat 5. I think a Cat 1 recession could very well happen. I doubt we're going to see a Cat 5 recession. And
so, Category 1 recession, what would that entail? What would a Category 1 recession look like, and how is that different than a more catastrophic recession or a depression?
Well, certainly there would be a broad-based downturn in economic activity, probably showing zero or negative growth for a period of time. 2 quarters, conceivably 3, something like that. That's a relatively short-term recession. Unemployment would rise. Today, unemployment is, 3.7%, 3.6%. It would rise to 4.5% to 5%, something like that. The economists believe that the natural rate of unemployment is above where it is today. So the natural rate might be 4.1 or 4.2. So it would rise into the 4 to 5 range in terms of unemployment. And very importantly, this is what the Fed would be wanting to happen, the inflation rate or the inflation pressures would decline. Maybe not all the way to the 2% target, but definitely to, say, 3% or below.
And when we were talking the other day, you mentioned something a lot of people have been saying, is that the workforce looks different than it did pre-COVID. What will it take to improve the labor force participation, and how should the Fed take that into consideration right now?
Well, there are some long-term trends at work. A long-term trend of decline in labor force participation that has been going on since roughly 2005 or 2006, something like that. So the backdrop of all this is the long-term trend seems to be a decline in labor force participation. Part of that is driven by demographics, the baby boomer generation retiring, and many of them retiring with no intention of coming back into the labor force. So that's sort of the backdrop of what may be a cyclical thing that we're seeing now. What would bring people back to the workforce would be, one, that they perceive that good jobs are available, and 2, they're running out of savings. They have a reason they need to go back to work, and perhaps something along the lines of their familial arrangements with child care, elder care are in a good place. There are a lot of reasons why we have seen what was a relatively tight labor market pre-COVID, but really a very tight labor market today. And there's just not one single cause to that. There's a number of reasons why that has developed. But I do think those of you who are employers should expect that the labor market is going to be tight for the foreseeable future, even with some uptick in participation.
And you mentioned there's several different reasons, though, that the labor market has changed. Can you expand on what some of those are?
Well, first we had a number of people who were, let's say, 55 years of age and older, who, when COVID came, assessed their situation, said, I'm just going to go ahead and retire. And many of those people, as I said, have retired with permanent intentions. So you take that slug out of the pre-COVID participation. Then it seems to be the case that many households have reevaluated the income needs, the arrangements they need to have in the household, and have come to the conclusion maybe they don't need two working adults. They can get by with one salary and one that takes care of child care, elder care, whatever it may be. So there's some of that going on as well. Then in certain categories of work, the jobs simply haven't come back. There's been a different picture in terms of the demand for labor. So like so many things in our economy, it's complex, and you can't put your finger on one thing that has caused this tightness. But if there is an overall longer-term impact kind of force at work, I would say it's demographics, the continuing aging of our adult population.
And so back to inflation, you brought that up earlier, and that's also top of mind for people here, I'm sure. What should the Fed be doing right now to combat that? Should they continue to raise interest rates?
Well, the Fed, and I think it deserves admiration, has stepped up and said, this is our problem. We're going to take responsibility for inflation. It's the appropriate thing for a central bank to do. Having said that, this is an inflation that has multiple causes, some of which are supply-side causes. And everyone in the audience is familiar with supply chain questions, the Ukraine war. So they are taking responsibility for inflation with a tool that is not completely adequate to all the causes, all the forces at work that are causing the inflation. I would also say it appears to me that the inflation is morphing or metastasizing, and it's broadening out, and some of the underlying pressures are changing. For example, today some of that pressure is in wages. It's in employment, cost of employment. They have very little choice, having taken responsibility, to continue to use the tool they have, which is interest rate. The federal funds rate is their policy tool, and then the interest rate structure basically ensues from what they do. And I think they will continue to raise the policy rate. At the next meeting, I would expect another 75 basis point move. Then the question will be, what picture do they present as we go into December? In order to dial back to a 50 basis point move, let us say at the December meeting, they need a credible reason to do that. And if the inflation data do not improve, then it's not inconceivable there be another 75 basis point move. At some point, they can't keep raising the policy rate by 75 basis points a meeting, but for the next 2 meetings, I think it's quite conceivable, and it depends very much on whether they see enough of a crack in the inflation trend to justify a step back to a smaller number, a 50 basis point increase. So I think they're doing the right thing. They don't have a lot of options other than to use interest rates to try to slow down the economy. And there are some signs, although not very convincing yet, that the economy and inflation are beginning to respond.
Oh, what are those signs?
Well, for example, if everyone remembers used cars, the difficulty in getting new cars put a lot of pressure on the used car market, and used cars were being, companies like AutoNation and others were advertising to sell your car to them so they could populate their lots. And there was a rise in used cars prices. Well, used cars are now, those prices are beginning to soften. The biggest sector, of course, is the residential real estate sector. And in residential real estate, you're seeing, although we have a sort of structural tightness in the supply of housing in the economy, you're beginning to see a slowdown in housing starts and permits, in existing home sales, because the mortgage rates have risen to a level that makes it unaffordable for certain buyers of houses. So those are 2 sectors that are very important, housing and autos, and they're showing some response. They are the most interest-sensitive sectors. So when interest rates rise, you tend to see an immediate effect in those sectors, whereas generally speaking, a rise in interest rates is a slower, the economy reacts with a lag, but in those sectors it's rather immediate.
So how did we get into this, high inflation situation? Were there any mistakes that the Fed made? Anything you would have done differently if you were still at the Fed?
Well, I think, yes, you would have to say that the Fed was slow to recognize the potential persistence of inflation, believed in the thesis that this was a supply chain driven problem and that the supply chains would correct. I would say parenthetically that I think the economics profession, as well as let's just say society in general, had no appreciation of how complex supply chains are and what happens when one or 2 pieces or elements of a supply chain are constricted in some way, what that does to the ability to deliver product in the final market. So, the Fed was slow to recognize that, yes, and even until March of this year continued with the program of quantitative easing, and then got into catch-up mode. I do think it's important, having been a public policy maker myself, to not sort of play Monday morning quarterbacking, but try to put yourself in the moment in which they were trying to evaluate what was going on, and then understand the decisions they made in that particular context. Very easy with what we know today to criticize the Fed for what they did in 2021 or even in 2020. But you have to kind of go back and say, yes, but what did they know at the time? And at the time, the supply chain correction, the transitory thesis was believable. It was plausible.
So maybe if you went back in time, maybe less of the quantitative easing. And you mentioned that supply chains are so much more complicated than everyone thinks. I mean, why is that? What happened? I mean, obviously there are a lot of supply chain problems impacting all aspects of the economy right now. I mean, what will it take for that to change?
Why did it become so complicated that no one understood it at the time it became a problem? Well, we've been through a few decades of globalization. Remember so many companies chasing the China price or chasing the lowest cost for a particular product or a particular intermediary product that they needed for a final product. And all of that stitched together in a complex transportation system. The just-in-time theory of how to run a production process was at work. It was a much more fragile situation than most people believed. It worked beautifully while it worked, but then along came COVID, and COVID disrupted this in multiple ways, and that fragility turned into really a lot of broken supply chains. So I think we may be in a transition right now because of the COVID experience of deglobalization, of regionalization of manufacturing sourcing, and and then of course there's the national security consideration related to China. There's a lot going on to redesign those supply chains. Many companies have gone to from just-in-time to just-in-case, meaning they build up inventories that they would never have carried pre-COVID. So the world has changed. It's changed because of this experience.
And yeah, the world's more interconnected. You see that with the supply chain, but you also mentioned the Ukraine war. When we were chatting the other day, you brought up the UK, and I saw just this morning the Prime Minister is already stepping down after 6 weeks there. And so how does all of this geopolitical risk impact the economy here in the U.S.?
Well, we cannot ignore what's going on in the rest of the world. There is systemic financial risk at any given time, and the events in the UK over the last 3 weeks have raised the concern on the part of Fed officials and regulators that maybe something would trigger a real financial problem of some kind, system problem. In the New York Times this morning, there's an article about the Fed interviewing, I think, 4 Wall Street securities firms, asking the question, could a meltdown like what we saw in the UK and the gilt market happen here? Generally speaking, I think the reaction is, well, it's not likely to happen, but there is always some risk. So it's not something to dismiss altogether. The Ukraine war has had the most impact on energy prices, as well as wheat and therefore food prices downstream. We're more or less energy sufficient in this country, so the direct impact in terms of supply is not affecting the United States, but the price does affect the United States. Even the price of natural gas or liquefied natural gas, which has local market impact. That is to say, it's not a one price globally, but still it's an energy substance that is influenced by global events. Having said all that, the U.S. economy, and this has been the case for a great deal of time, tends to be a little bit more insulated than, say, European economies or Japanese economies from pressures that come from the global context. So as Fed officials, the way the Federal Open Market Committee and Jay Powell and his team tend to look at this is they look at global events and the spillover into the domestic U.S. economy. And if there is spillover, then it's a matter clearly of concern. But the U.S. economy, as I said, is a bit more self-sufficient and more insulated from some of these factors that are happening geopolitically.
So from global to local, you have a lot of experience in the Atlanta ecosystem. What is it that's unique about Atlanta and its economy here?
It's a well-diversified economy. It has certain themes, which everyone knows. You know, the logistics theme, for example, or the transportation theme. It's a major transportation hub. In areas that are interesting to the venture community, this is a big transaction fintech community here in Atlanta. It's also a corporate headquarters city for a number of global companies. You know, Coca-Cola, UPS come to mind, but it's now a quite deep corporate community. Overall, the makeup of the Atlanta region is pretty close to the industrial composition of the U.S. economy overall, or at least the Southeast generally is. And that's a big change from 50 or 60 years ago. So as the national economy goes, so goes the Atlanta region generally. And the Atlanta economy pretty much mirrors what we would say are the characteristics of the national economy at this time and the outlook for the national economy.
All right, well, thank you so much. Appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Katie.